Welcome to the Grawert podcast. Join us as we delve into the power of nutrition with Dr. Brooke Scheller, author of How to Eat to Change How You Drink. Discover how to reshape your relationship with alcohol through holistic wellness strategies. Tune in for insights, inspiration, and practical tips for a healthier lifestyle.
Hi guys, welcome back to the Well Aware podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lauren, and I also have the pleasure of being the Chief Medical Officer here at Aware Recovery Care. Speaking of pleasure, I am so excited this morning to welcome our very first guest for our Aware Book Club series. Our guest here is a doctor of clinical nutrition, a nationally recognized health expert, founder of Functional Sobriety, and also an author. Today, we're going to be discussing her book that's called How to Eat to Change How You Drink. Heal your gut, mend your mind, and improve nutrition to change your relationship with alcohol. It's been called one of the most influential books of the past 5 years. So I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Scheller this morning, Dr. Brooke Scheller. Hi, Dr. Scheller. How are you?
Hi, Lauren. Hi, Dr. Lauren. It's so nice to meet you. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm excited for our conversation today.
Yes, me too. So your book, which I found so fascinating, really dives into how your relationship with alcohol can affect your gut and how making really some simple eating habits and eating changes can improve your relationship with alcohol. Talk a little bit more kind of about your expertise in nutrition and your journey to sobriety and what inspired you to write the book.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking this question. I love sharing this story and I love sharing about that aha moment because it's something that for me, and I think for so many of us, we all have these little moments in our lives that when we make a choice or make a change can really change the course or trajectory of our whole life. And for me, eliminating alcohol and getting sober was one of those big moments where I felt like a lot of the challenges, most of the challenges that I was having in my life, physically, mentally, emotionally, personally, professionally, many of those unlocked when I eliminated alcohol from my life. And I had gotten multiple degrees in nutrition prior to quitting drinking. And I share a lot about my story in the book. I have a whole chapter called The Doctor and the Wine Bottle. And, you know, like so many of us in the health world, there was this health halo around red wine in particular, that if you have a little bit of this, it's good for you. There's antioxidants. And I remember learning in my training, in my doctoral studies, about how Pinot Noir was the highest in antioxidants. And, you know, I knew deep down that my alcohol use was a problem, but I was finding these ways and these loopholes that I could kind of convince myself that maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe it wasn't so problematic to my health. And I think that this is a great example of how this can not only affect healthcare practitioners, but also the general public, right? We've really, unfortunately, created a society that is, for lack of a better word, addicted to alcohol. And we've kind of convinced them that that's okay, right? Because we've shared that there's maybe these potential health benefits that people have abused. And I was, like so many people early on in sobriety journey, the first couple months are kind of a blur where, you know, you're a lot of things are changing in your life and you're really focusing on how to get day to day without the alcohol. But for me, I was, lucky enough to have an opportunity prior to getting sober to actually author a textbook chapter in a book on integrative approaches to substance use disorders. And during this time, for about 6 months, I had been working on this project, writing this chapter for nutrition and supplementation for substance use disorders. And this was about 9 months before I myself got sober. And when I went through my own experience, I started adopting some of these recommendations that I had researched. I had started taking some supplements to help with cravings. I had started adopting some of these nutrition changes. And I got really interested in diving deeper into the science on this. And especially in areas like the gut microbiome, for example, which is really an unturned stone, I think, in this arena. of how much alcohol affects our gut microbiome and how much that creates this feedback loop, basically, that can cause us to continue to desire alcohol, and create different stressors on the brain through the gut brain axis. We could dive into all those things. But I was only 3 months sober when I had what I feel like was a lightning bolt moment that said, you have to write a book on this. You have to write a whole book on this, not just a chapter. And I had no idea how to write a book. I had no idea how to go about the process. But like so many things in my sobriety or in my life after getting sober, the doors kind of opened. I wrote a proposal. I found a book agent and we pitched the book and got a book deal. And then everything kind of unfolded from there. And so I was quite early on in my sobriety journey when this idea struck me. And what I always share is that, while this is through the lens of sobriety, this is mainly through the lens of health and nutrition. And how do we utilize that as a tool in our sobriety journey, in our alcohol reduction journey, whatever that looks like for you? It's really an opportunity for us not to not to go gung ho and adopting in intermittent fasting and keto and all these different kind of intense protocols, but we're already eating 3 times a day, most of us. And so if we can just optimize those choices, it can actually make it easier for us to put down a drink, make it easier for us to stay sober and to feel better sooner.
Yeah. Wow. What a great summary. One of the things you talked about, which really resonated with me, was this large gap between social drinking and what we call alcohol dependence or alcoholism, and how really there's a big gray area. And folks often struggle to know, what level is safe drinking, how much is okay. And there's not a lot really of guidance out there on that. And you also go into the importance of identifying your alcohol archetype, and you kind of go through 3 different types of drinkers, which as you were describing it in the audible, I was thinking, yep, I know somebody like that. Yep, I know somebody like that. Can you tell our audience, kind of walk us through what those 3 different main types of drinkers are and why it's important to know which category you fall into?
Yeah. So this is so funny. When I wrote this book, this was like a component of the book that I never thought would be as helpful for people as it is. And after the book published and I started having conversations about it, this discussion comes up all the time about these 3 drinking archetypes. And part of the reason why I developed these archetypes was when I started working with others around nutrition and sobriety, probably early 2022, I had launched some challenges, some dry Januaries, some sober Octobers, and different, programs where people could start to explore alcohol freedom through the lens of nutrition. And I had some clients that would come in and would have been drinkers who drank like me, someone who at the end maybe was drinking quite heavily. And that is oftentimes the category of person who seeks full sobriety, right? Or is needing treatment or more intense type of care. Usually it's when we get to that rock bottom moment, right? That we really need to make a change. But what I found most interesting was that I had a lot of, particularly women, coming to me who did not drink like me, but still wanted help stopping. They maybe only drank a couple times a week or a couple times a month, but they felt like when they started, they couldn't stop. They were unlikely to pursue programs like Alcoholics Anonymous because they did not identify with that heavier type of drinking. And thankfully, in the world we live in today, there's a lot of other programs that support this kind of quote unquote gray area drinking, where we have these discussions now opening up for people who maybe don't feel like they have gotten to that place yet where they've hit a rock bottom. They're not daily drinkers and they feel like, they need kind of a unique level of support. And so when I started doing this work, my brain, my science mind, and I'm sure you understand this, Dr. Lauren, like I'm always like, okay, well, why? Why is it that my body became someone who wanted to drink every day at the end? And why is it that someone else maybe struggles more in this social environment? I started thinking about the biochemistry. I'm thinking about the science, right? And so part of the reason that I developed these archetypes was for me to create a lens to look through from a nutrition or a science or functional medicine perspective. And so the three drinking archetypes are the social drinker, the stress drinker, and the habitual drinker. And I'll break each of those down briefly. The social drinker is exactly like it sounds. It's someone who's drinking mostly in that social environment. It's a few times a week, it's a few times a month. Oftentimes, they feel like when they start, they can't stop. They have one drink and it turns into two, three, and they wake up with a hangover. It is someone who maybe is that weekend warrior, and they, again, don't feel like they need to explore maybe full sobriety, but they're saying that something's off, right? Like they feel a loss of control in some way. The second drinking archetype is that stress drinker. And again, exactly like it sounds, it's someone who's drinking mostly from stress. They're drinking at the end of the long day. They're drinking after a triggering situation, a big life change. COVID was a big one with stress drinkers, right? This kind of maybe pushed some of these people who were not drinking as often into drinking more often because now stress is really high. And that third archetype is the habitual drinker. And this is someone much more in alignment that we would see, with addiction, that we would maybe diagnose with a substance use disorder, who is maybe drinking more like daily or almost daily and really having more of that chemical dependency. And what I find is that oftentimes in the folks that I've worked with, they've maybe started out as social drinkers. They became stress drinkers as, life stressors changed, as maybe alcohol consumption picked up, and then ultimately became that habitual drinker.
Yeah.
And so sometimes people have almost gone through each phase and ultimately landed in that habitual drinker.
Got it. Yeah, that's so fascinating to think about the progression there, folks going from one category to another. Um, well, the other thing you talk about, I think, is alcohol's really important relationship with blood sugar and how alcohol actually lowers blood sugar, which leads to more alcohol cravings. And then you go into some really specific tips for kind of a 4-week plan. Talk to us a little bit more about alcohol's important relationship with blood sugar and how that informs or influences your recommendations for folks on their food intake.
Yeah, this is a key area that I talk about because so many people struggle with alcohol cravings. And then when we take alcohol away, they struggle with the sugar cravings, right? And part of that, the reason why that's happening, part of the reason why the sugar cravings are increasing like that, a lot of the discussion today, Dr. Lauren, as you know, is about dopamine and about how when we take the alcohol away, we have this loss of dopamine and we're looking for these other kind of quick hits of dopamine for feel good, for that pick me up. But the other piece that we're not talking about enough is this blood sugar element. And I actually like talking about this more because I think there's a lot more that we can do in terms of influencing blood sugar levels through foods that we eat. Whereas with dopamine and the brain, a lot of that is just takes time, right? It takes time for the brain to rebalance. It takes time for dopamine systems to kind of come back into equilibrium. But we can influence our food choices and we can influence blood sugar. And what I've found in doing this work, and now having worked with hundreds of clients really around the world, that some of these recommendations for blood sugar, they work and they work really, really well. And so I think that this is a really, really important, probably one of the most important nutritional pieces that you can start to implement if you are alcohol free, going alcohol free on that sober journey, and especially if you're struggling with those alcohol or sugar cravings. But what happens is there's a lot of research around how when we consume alcohol regularly, it affects how our body releases glucagon and insulin, so the hormones that manage our blood sugar. And over time, we as alcohol users or previous alcohol users have a tendency to lean more into hypoglycemia. So we have drops in blood sugar that can manifest as cravings for carbohydrates, sugar, and you guessed it, alcohol. And part of that is because we're looking to get that feel good. We're looking to get a source of energy. We're looking for that source of fuel for our body because our body really runs on that glucose. And alcohol is an interesting thing because we often think about, well, if I don't have sugar or carbohydrates with my alcohol, yes, those are going to cause an increase in blood sugar, but it's actually the ethanol molecule itself that is the problem, right? That is the one that's actually affecting how we manage blood glucose. And there's a book from a long while back that I reference in my book where the author talks about how about 95% of chronic alcohol users have blood sugar irregularities. And
Wow.
so if that is true, this is a reference from many, I think the 90s. Um, there's not a lot of research to fully support that quite yet, but there is a good bit of research around alcoholic hypoglycemia, which is what we call it. And that unfortunately, a lot of times we're looking at this in really heavy alcohol users. So there's really a need for more research in people who are a social drinker or who are maybe only consuming a few times a week and maybe in that moderate drinking arena. But the good news about this is that, again, we can have a lot of control over blood sugar through the foods that we eat. So some of the key principles that I lay out in the book and that I work with clients are incorporating more protein throughout the day to help stabilize blood sugar, to ensure that you're never going more than about 3 or 4 hours between meals and snacks. That is going to make sure that you're never getting into that low blood sugar state. Because once we get into that state, we have way less control over our choices. Our
Mm.
body goes into survival mode. And that is when the willpower, quote unquote, kicks in. And I share this with clients so often too, because I mean, I'm sure you've heard this, Dr. Lauren. I don't have the willpower to say no to a drink or to a candy or to a treat, right? How often that word comes up. And typically it's the body's physiological response, right? That is so strong and overpowering. And we're kind of taking that on as blame. But this is a good indication that we can actually have a lot more control over these things than we think.
Yeah, I love that. I love how you explain the science behind it so folks understand, you're not a bad person or a weak person for the food or the substance choices, given that close interplay with the blood sugar and just giving those really practical tips. The other thing I think just love, and you already pointed this out, but these are really practical things you can do immediately that have immediate outcomes versus, as you mentioned with dopamine, most of the NIDA studies show it takes about a year at least for dopamine irregularities to even out. And my patients, when I say that, will look at me like I have three heads. Like, are you kidding me? It's going to take a year. And as you said, these are really simple choices like having snacks in between meals, picking high protein things that will have immediate impact. I think that will make them more doable for folks. So
Yeah. And the afternoon snack is the most important thing of the day. So if you are listening and you want to take one tidbit away from this, I would say have an afternoon high protein snack between 3 and 5 p.m., especially if you're someone who is experiencing a lot of those afternoon cravings, that witching hour, that 5 o'clock happy hour feeling. Oftentimes, again, it's been a long, you haven't eaten since lunch or you had an afternoon snack that was high sugar, high carb. And now you get to the end of the day, stress is high, cortisol is up, and you are needing something again to quote unquote take the edge off. And a lot of times it is simply low blood sugar.
mm,
And I always suggest to people, even if you're not hungry, have this snack because it's going to help ward that off later. I had a client just tell me that the protein recommendations in the afternoon cured her happy hour cravings. And
wow.
yes, it is so simple, right? It almost sounds silly how simple it is. But I've seen it work again with hundreds of clients at this point. And so, like you said, it's immediate action. It's not something that we have to wait a year. It's not a medication that has a side effect, right? We're already eating. So, a lot of it is just about how do we make these little changes that can really have a big difference.
Yeah, it's so funny you mentioned the afternoon snack because as I was listening to your book yesterday, and I keep going like this because I was on Bose headphones. Um, it was about 2 or 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and I was about to walk into a meeting, and I saw they at this conference they had fruit laid out, And before listening to your book, I would have just gone into the meeting, but I thought, I really need to have to eat afternoon snack, or else it's gonna it just helps so much with from what you're saying. And so I grabbed some fruit, and then later when I was eating dinner, it really did make a huge difference. So yeah, I mean, you're right. It sounds so simple, but yet really, really powerful at the same time. What would be, as we're I mean, I could talk to you all day. This is so fascinating. I also enjoyed you talked about sober curious, which is a great term, I think, for people exploring their relationship with alcohol. What would be your, for our listeners who are tuning in here, what would be your top like three takeaways, or two takeaways that you want people to hear from this? I know you said afternoon snacks. What else should people know? Kind of the core message from your book.
Yeah, so I'll share that the book is broken down into a couple of different parts, as you know, Dr. Lauren. So the first part is really introducing the overlap between nutrition and alcohol and alcohol use disorder. It tells a little bit about my story, and it gets into the three drinking archetypes. So we covered a lot of that in the discussion today. The second part of the book, actually my favorite part, which is where I get into a lot of the science around the gut. There's a whole chapter on the gut. There's a whole chapter on blood sugar and hormones, which also talks about cortisol and stress and those types of things. And then the brain and the brain's neurotransmitters, and how nutrients like B vitamins and vitamin D and magnesium and zinc, how all of those actually influence our brain and our mood and our cognition. But they're also the same nutrients that are depleted when we drink alcohol. So we basically create this vicious cycle of we drink, we deplete nutrients, we feel like crap, for lack of a better word, and we, drink again because we don't feel good. And it creates this kind of ongoing cycle. And I really love the science pieces, because I think that what I have found in working with my clients in particular is that there are some people who really just they like to know the science. They want to understand what's going on in their body, and it helps to change the way that they think about it. Right? When we know maybe how alcohol is having this direct impact on an area that we are looking to improve or change, it changes our thinking process around it, right? And for me, that's been a really helpful thing. I'm one of those how it works people. I love the science and love the understanding. And there's a lot of people out there that really are intrigued by that. And it helps them not only understand it better, but it helps them stay compliant with their goals, because they have a kind of better understanding of what alcohol is really doing to the system. And as I mentioned earlier on, the gut is one of those other really interesting areas for me too, because been a ton of discussion around the gut and the gut microbiome over the last 10 years or so. And it's really under discussed how much alcohol influences the microbiome, how it influences intestinal permeability and breaks down the lining of the gut. And a lot of these things contribute to all of the health conditions that we experience today. And so I really believe that, or something that I would share with listeners is, if you are interested in that piece and kind of understanding more in that deep dive, the book does talk a lot about that and kind of walks you through these different areas. And then the third part of the book, as we mentioned, is really the guide. So it's a 30-day guide to cutting back or to elimination. So whichever your goal is. And we framed the book in this way because we wanted to make it applicable for people with all different drinking archetypes. If it's someone who wants to or feels like they should completely eliminate, that it can support them, but that it can also support someone who's feeling like they are a social drinker and they want to just cut back. And in that last section, there's a section on nutrition. There's also a section on lifestyle, so bringing in the other elements of exercise and mindfulness. There's also an entire chapter on community, which, as you know, is key. And part of why I launched a community in 2022, because we have to, see other people doing it. We have to find these relationships with people who have similar experiences with us, and community is a key piece in my mind as well. And then lastly, in the book, there's recipes. So there's 40 food recipes and 10 drink recipes that help to support your journey and provide a lot of these healing mechanisms or healing tools, healing foods, etc., so that you can kind of have that well-rounded support to your journey. So I would say that the biggest takeaway and the kind of top things that I share on most podcasts are the protein recommendations, making sure you're getting lots and lots of protein throughout the day, including in the morning for breakfast, not skipping breakfast, because that is going to influence blood sugar all throughout the day. And that afternoon snack is really going to be key to supporting as well. And then there's a lot of discussion in there around foods that can support healing the liver and the gut and all of these areas that are affected too.
So great. So great to have these practical tips. And as a non-chef, a non-cooker who doesn't like to touch my oven, I so appreciate the recipes as well. Well, listen, Dr. Scheller, thank you so much for your insights and expertise with us today. Again, guys, the book is called How to Eat to Change How You Drink. It's on Audible, which is where I heard it. You can get it in bookstores, Amazon. It's really wonderful and will give you a lot of great practical tips. So we're so happy to have you today. We're thankful for you coming on. Thank you for what you're giving back to the world. This is such needed knowledge, and I think will help so many people. And for our listeners, that concludes our episode of the Well Aware podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe. We're now on all platforms. And until next time, take care of yourself and do something nice for yourself today.